All right. We are live, MythVision podcast. I'm always excited about these episodes with Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. It looks like you're going to be trying to survive the hurricane down there at the moment.
Yeah, we have apparently it's a tropical storm officially. At least that's what my warning text messages are telling me. So if anybody loses me, I'll either try to come back on but we have a lull right now. It's not so bad. But if you see me doing this, I'm just watching the tornado go by. Right?
There's a trailer flying at my house right now. And
exactly. Yeah.
I titled this just like, what the heck is Paul up to, right? Like, there's so many Pauline scholars and so much Pauline literature. And I recently had Jennifer Bird come on, and she kind of made this comment, like, she made a comment something like, look, there's all these white men that like die on this hill about Paul, trying to figure out Paul. Like we got real world matters that are going on. But I figure we could dive into what you think is happening with this guy in this episode, at least to go 35 minutes or so, where we're going back and forth. People can super chat their questions. And once we kind of have fun going into this, creativity might come up for more questions and they can ask, and then we'll take super chats and go from there.
Okay, that sounds great. So what do you want me to say?
Well, the first thing I'd like to do is let everybody know they didn't quite know this about you. And this is something that since you're a MythVision follower, you get to see the sneak peek. She's actually one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you don't believe me, here, you're an eyewitness. We are MythVision. I hope you enjoyed the intro, everybody, and I did put her in the little intro there on the far right. You are, I think, the horseman of death,
which I'm completely fine with.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad
that works
you are.
for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the title of this was something like, "What the heck is up with Paul?" And I was watching some of the comments go by while we were seeing the intro, something like, that's a valid question. He was high on opium, those kinds of things. The problem with Paul, there are several things that I can say, and we didn't really game this out ahead of time. So feel free to jump in at any point, and I'll try to keep an eye on things that people say. But the thing with him is that it can be a little bit confusing because he has been imagined and reimagined. I mean, this is the case with a lot of things in early Christianity, but so many times, and particularly by people like Augustine. So in a time period that's pretty close, actually, relatively speaking, to when his letters were being preserved and circulated, and he was being fashioned as something like a founding figure for early Christianity. And so what has happened to him as a figure, what's happened to his letters, is that he has basically been blamed for a lot of things, I think, that are representative of later interpretation of what he was trying to say. To some extent, you could argue he hasn't really been taken on his own terms. So you have the problem of his letters, interpretation of his letters, the way that other people have interpreted him, and that's perpetuated. So things like he's obsessed with sin, or attributing those kinds of things to him. We can talk more about that. The other problem you have is something like Acts of the Apostles, which essentially became almost like the sequel to the Gospels, but one that foregrounds Paul in a lot of ways. It's almost like his hero story. Tries to make all of these historical connections and give sort of this backstory to this guy. And we can't be certain about most of that. So things like, who his teachers were. I mean, even the idea that he's from Tarsus, sure, but that's not something he ever tells us, right? So to the extent that we can recreate who this guy was or try to understand him again on his own terms, we're in a tricky spot because we have the weight of the interpretation on one side, the bio that gets attributed to him on the other.
And the
So
baggage that we bring
yeah.
to trying to figure him out, right?
Yeah, and like he's often read, you have a couple of layers here too of problematic evidence. His letters are often called, the term that scholars use is occasional letters, or I don't know, you can call it maybe occasional evidence in the sense that, it's one side of a conversation. He's writing a letter. We don't have the letter that was written to him or that he's responding to. And so you have kind of that one-sided conversation aspect. But then in a context where people are hearing him maybe say in church, there's a lot of stuff that does not get read in church from Paul's letters, and for good reason, because a lot of it's kind of, like it's not good for a sermon, say, or, like a passage here or there out of context. You have an additional, like distance from whatever the original context was, and then it being read in a context where you don't really know what's going on, why he's bringing up what he's bringing up necessarily, because it's being used for other purposes. So
We're kind of working backwards too to try and are we, as critical scholars, is it wrong of us to go to the Gospels and try to pretend that we can parse out Paul? I think so. But when we look at Paul's letters, as someone who is, I mean, you're a classicist, so you're like, you know how to look at the classics, the Greco-Roman world, and in which these letters come up in, which you recently, not too long ago, when you were on before talking about how the Gospels were written possibly by educated elites in some sense. I'm wanting to kind of picture that as we have this canon, right? And trying to get to Paul. Like, what is this guy doing when these elites are using Paul? Mark is, whoever this Mark person, really, whoever the author
at the least.
Yeah, like, what is going on? Why are they using Paul? Maybe is a question, and then we can get into Paul and maybe what you've learned. We can't talk about everything because there's a little sneak peek about something you're publishing soon about Paul and the moon and 1 Corinthians 15 and whatnot, just to tease people. But what do we do? Let's start with one question at a time in terms of this, and then we'll get to super chats once we're done having our little fun on Paul.
Okay, so here, let's do this. Let me tell you a little bit about what do we know about this guy.
Okay.
And what do we think he was doing? And that kind of sets the historical landscape. And then we can think about canon and we can think about how he was used. So what we know about this guy is that he is highly educated relatively in the ancient world. So he's part of what's often called a retainer class. So he's not super elite, but he's kind of like right here. And we know this basically not by too much of what he says, although a little bit about what he says about himself, but we can see it in the letters themselves. It's sort of its own piece of evidence in terms of his references, his mastery of language, his use of rhetoric, his understanding of philosophy, his understanding of the Hebrew Bible. Now, I say Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament because I want to be, respectful of what that material is outside of Christianity. But he's reading what's called the Septuagint. So he's reading the Hebrew Bible, not in Hebrew, but he's reading it in Greek. He's a native Greek speaker. That's very clear. And he's been educated at the level of what we usually call progymnasitas. So he's had a fair amount of schooling, and he tells us he's a Pharisee. So he's a teacher, more or less, or an interpreter of the Hebrew Bible, again, in Greek. And what that means, though, here's another one of those anachronistic, tricky things where we have later people like the rabbis claiming a legacy or a tradition that they themselves come from the Pharisees. And they tell us a little bit about that history. But somebody in the first century outside of Judea who's claiming they're a Pharisee, it's not exactly clear what that life would have been like. But more or less, he seems to be a worker for the aristocracy or for more elite persons. When he talks about persecuting early Christians, what we might call early Christians or Christ followers before he has his conversion, and those are terms we should talk about too, That seems to be kind of like what he would do for a career. He interprets the Hebrew Bible. He kind of is a bag man, maybe, or he's, like he's working for the higher ups. What persecute or I think pursue, sometimes people use different words for what he was supposed to be doing. It's imagined that he's killing early Christians, but I think that that's maybe going a little too far. So he's had, a good education. He's used to doing these kinds of interpretations of the Hebrew Bible. He is very skilled in Greco-Roman philosophy, what we might call Greco-Roman philosophy, but specifically Plato. He knows Plato really well. He seems to know some Stoicism, at least to some extent. And because he's been educated in this, Greco-Roman way, he's utilizing that in the way that he's trying to convince the Gentiles, the non-Jews that he's writing to in these letters, of his positions. So that's basically the extent of what we know. I know a lot of people will say things like he knows Hebrew or he knows Aramaic. He knows enough to like quote a couple of words.
Yeah,
right?
I know a little Spanish or something. Yeah,
exactly. Like, sometimes, but like, can you, write in that language? Can you? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
I know how to
that's a little bit
spell
questionable.
certain words from taking a few classes in
Sure.
high school.
I live in Miami, like
you have
right?
to.
Right.
Yeah. I lived in
but with
Puerto Rico for 3 years, so I know a little bit, but I never really.
yeah, that kind of functional knowledge,
Right.
maybe he has, but he's educated, like his native tongue is Greek. So that's basically what we know about his background. In terms of how he got messed up in all of this, this Jesus business, here's where the Augustine point that I was making before kind of comes in. So, once you have later understandings of firm distinctions between Judaism and Christianity, this idea that he converts from Judaism to Christianity becomes common. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some are more pernicious than others. Ideas of sort of superseding Judaism, things like that, that over the years are a factor in this. But really, in his age, he's Jewish. He's a Jewish Pharisee. He's speaking to Gentiles, but in his mind, what he says is that he basically thinks he's a prophet. He thinks he's a Jewish prophet who has been designated by the Israelite God to continue in this line of other prophets. And so when he's talking to Gentiles, he's using Greco-Roman philosophy and terms and ideas because he grew up with them. But he never deviates from the idea that he himself is Jewish, Jesus is Jewish, this is a Jewish movement. What he thinks is that, his understanding of the origins of the problem that Jesus becomes a solution to is that everybody in the beginning was basically a child or under the Jewish God. But Gentiles deviated. They moved away from the Jewish God. They started worshiping idols. They started worshiping the wrong things. So God designates Abraham as this father to become, this originator of a new generation or generations of a new people who are devoted to the Jewish God. But he also understands that prediction to say that those Gentiles, those people who have deviated, will come back. And in the fullness of time and at the end of time, there's going to be an event. And this is actually something, this idea of, eons kind of ending. The Stoics have this too. So this is not unique to Judaism, but the idea that there's going to be some kind of end time where a certain number of these Gentiles who, in the beginning sort of deviated away. And that was the reason for Abraham, the reason for these other prophets to continue this kind of course of history. That particular history of human beings is going to end. And Jesus is the marker of the beginning of that. Because Jesus, who he often calls Christ Jesus, the anointed one, he, he's crucified, he dies, he's resurrected by God and given God's spirit, or pneuma. And the fact that he's resurrected, death is considered one of the great evils of the world. And so since this, Jewish messianic apocalyptic figure is going to come and wipe out all the evils of the world, including what's called, like the archons is the word often used, sort of like the earthly rulers. You might imagine the Roman imperial system being kind of in the bullseye of that. But the greatest evil that everyone faces is death. And Jesus defeats death. So that's how, once the resurrected Jesus appears to Paul, he knows that this is the real deal. So the idea of the conversion, he doesn't convert from Judaism to Christianity. He sees the risen Christ and says, like, oh, like I know the Hebrew Bible. I know I know what's supposed to happen. I know the scriptures. The first great evil has been defeated. God has chosen Christ Jesus to be that figure who's going to usher in this new age. He's the Messiah. And he must have picked me to be the prophet that tells everybody about it, because somebody has to tell the Gentiles, again, the ones who have fallen away, who have to come back into the fold before the end time. Somebody needs to do that work. Peter and James, they're not going to do it, right? Like Peter and James make it clear they're carrying on whatever was going on in Jerusalem. So Paul takes that on. So he's going to appeal to these Gentiles, explain to them the significance of Christ, explain to them the predictions in the scriptures, and then try to bring them into the fold of this Jewish movement in order to either A, do so before the end time scenario, because he's been tasked with this by God, or B, do so in order to bring about that end time scenario where Jesus will, as I say, come, I think of David Bowie, like the Starman's going to come down from the sky. And
that's what Paula Fredrickson, wrote a book, Paul the Pagan's Apostle, on the same topic. Yeah, I think there's so many interesting things that you have said in this. And like you just say it so smooth and very concise. I think that's what makes you unique. And when I've had you on before, you did the same thing. When you explain these things, I'm like, you just like unpacked Paul so eloquently. Everybody stop writing books about Paul. We figured it out now. Like it just seems like it's that easy. Because that's what
no, go ahead.
No, because I've been reading variations of Paul and I get it. We can flex on a certain text. We can flex on a certain thing and get caught up. Was Paul against the Torah, or was Paul, saying it has no use anymore, or is it only for Gentiles that he's saying don't?
And that too.
Hey, I know you can. That's why I know. You know what? Have fun. I'll be back in 2 hours. I'm just kidding.
No, well, I mean, like what I would say is like one thing that I try to do is I don't know everything that tends to be said about the Gospels or Paul, and kind of, like one of my things is that I try not to get too bogged down by contemporary theology, because then, of course, then you have that additional problem of when you're trying to read the ancient text in context. You have, all of this other kind of interpretation that's often very convincing, and so I'm trying to make sure I maintain a certain kind of professional distance from later theology.
Right.
But one thing that I do know some of the ways that these letters have been interpreted, or he's understood, Paul is understood. So when I give that description that I just gave, I am trying to kind of hit on the points that I think often come up for people in their own understandings or biography or interpretation of Paul. As for the law, that's a big one.
I knew you were going to do it.
And that's related to Augustine too, because often there's this idea like, well, Paul is about law versus works.
Right.
that was a very Lutheran idea as well later on. And so, this is where you had stereotypes about Judaism being legalistic, or, like too focused on the law, or too focused on, I kind of like, I don't want to get into all the stereotypes, but I think I've covered it. Whereas Paul, is updating things, and now it's all about like what you do, and it's not about following the law. That's not exactly what Paul is saying, actually. That's really more of again, Augustine Lutheran kind of later interpretation. What Paul is saying is, okay, God created this covenant with his people, and he's done so through Abraham. He did so through Moses. Again, all these other Jewish figures. So it's kind of been, over the course of time, this has been established with his people. And part of that was the law. When he says the law, he means the first 5 books of Moses. And in the law, you have basically guidelines on how to live a moral life or an ethical life, because we're mortal, we're weak. This is where the idea that Paul's all about sin. He's about missing the mark, which is really what the word in Greek for sin means. But we're susceptible to these things. We have passions, we get sick, we die. We're what did Kristen Stewart call us? Hold on. She called us something like pleasure bags. I loved that. I was exactly like, what? Some people understand what I'm talking about here. But we are just susceptible to all of these things, to the passions, to kind of our innate instincts. So the law is there in part to help identify the ways that we tend to sort of fall away from an ethical way of living. Now, this is not exclusive to Judaism. This is something, too, by the way, that this is what all the philosophers are obsessed with as well, the Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers. But the law is there to point those things out. And the law was there as a covenant, again, between God and his people. Now, there's a new covenant, according to Paul, that is being established through Christ Jesus. And so because of everything I just described, Jesus dies, he resurrects, because of his faithfulness, Jesus's faithfulness in God's plan, he goes through with it. He gets crucified. He's rewarded with the resurrection, more or less. He defeats death. He's given a spiritual body, a pneumatic body by God that is no longer susceptible to all of those mortal frailties. And that is what those Gentiles who now establish through Jesus, it's a new covenant with the Gentiles. And those Gentiles that accept this, who are brought into the fold of this movement that Paul is describing, are going to share in that. There are different ways that he describes this. Sometimes he calls it participating in Christ, which we can talk more about. I'm sure it'll come up again. Just ideas of being in Christ. You see that all through his letters. So the Gentiles who get baptized, who participate in Eucharist, who participate in all of the things that he outlines, are going to share in that spirit, in that pneuma, and they can expect to also resurrect. They can expect to have the same, pneumatic body that Christ got. They can expect to live in that idyllic afterlife scenario that seems to be promised by this idea of a Messiah coming and basically starting a new world order. And so that is the new covenant between God and these Gentiles being brought back in. But the old covenant, quote unquote, the law, that original covenant between God and his people, that's still valid. It's still there. So the Jewish people still have their covenant, but now these Gentiles have a new covenant. And you hear Paul talk about the new covenant quite often. And so you have two kind of mechanisms here for tying two different groups of people to the Jewish God. What gets confusing is that he often talks about the law in terms that we might consider, not derogatory, but, he'll be like, oh, well, the law was here, but now we have this new thing, right? It's that kind of dichotomy, rhetorical dichotomy, that gets us in trouble. But he always says the law is spiritual. The law is good. The law served its purpose. It's almost like the law was a babysitter, right? And continues to be valid because it's still pointing out to us the ways in which we can falter, ways in which...
Isn't this where Paula Fredrickson will say stuff like, when you hear that, right, people who think Paul's antinomian and anti-law and he's trying to get rid of it, whereas more older scholarship was on that Paul was doing this. Now it's Paul within Judaism school. So now they're like, hold on. What if Paul's saying these things to a Gentile audience? And the whole purpose rhetorically is to get them to run away from going to that covenantal law and join the Christ law, this whole thing. But where I get the real question mark that comes up is Paul acts like in Galatians, he sounds like he is no longer, it sounds like he's part of this new law. Whereas isn't he a Jew?
Yeah, like 2 to 4, he's kind of like, Moses wrote on stone, wrote, but I'm writing on your heart. Like he does. That's why I'm saying there's like kind of a rhetorical dichotomy there.
Yeah.
That gets us in trouble. But he always comes back to the law is spiritual. The law is still good. The thing that is problematic about it, this comes up in Romans 2 as well, where he says, like, the law keeps pointing out to me how I suck. Right? Like the problem with the law is like, it's not possible to follow it because no human being can follow it. But we keep trying to be good. We try to be ethical and we try to follow the law to the letter because we're trying to, obey God. And we know that this is there again as kind of like a roadmap to how to live an ethical life, but nobody can follow it. It's just not possible. And so then it just makes me like self-conscious that it shows me like all the ways that I sin like on the daily, and it makes me feel bad about myself. That's no good. But guess what? We're going to resurrect either because we've been following the law as God's people, as Jews, or because we're part of this new covenant as Gentiles. And so, it's going to all kind of wash out in the end, right? Like if you've been an observant Jew and tried to follow the law, you're going to still be one of God's people. If you are a Gentile who participates in Christ, you will also be one of God's people. But he does not think that these new Gentiles need to follow, say, dietary laws. They don't need to circumcise, right? So the other thing to keep in mind that you're kind of highlighting here is that he's not the only game in town, as I like to. He's got a lot of other people, whether he calls them super apostles, we don't know what that means, or he just calls them opponents. A lot of them also seem to be Jewish, who are saying, and this happens in Galatians, they are saying you need to follow the law. You need to circumcise. I think Galatians is the one where he says, if you circumcise and listen to these other a-holes, I hope the knife slips, right?
Yes.
Like he says
our favorite part in Paul. Yeah.
He has a lot of good lines, but that one, that one's pretty good.
Hope you cut the whole thing off.
Yeah, exactly. Like I hope, because he knows there are these other competitors out there who have a slightly different message. Maybe, and this would explain a lot, maybe they don't have the education that he has. They still also, subscribe to this idea that Christ Jesus is the Messiah, but they weren't trained in progymnasita. They don't know the Greco-Roman world as well in terms of the philosophy, the logic, the references, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. So they say to become part of this movement, you must follow the law. But Paul doesn't. There are a lot of people scholars, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there are scholars who speculate like, well, maybe that's why Paul's a little bit more successful. He writes it down. And also you don't have to follow the law. You have a new covenant. You don't have to worry about the dietary laws. You don't have to circumcise. Can you imagine circumcising as a male adult?
No, I'm like, that gets into all sorts of other things. Yeah, no, I'm afraid of anything like that. So, especially
without painkillers, without
I'm afraid
of doing
a
little bit of Neosporin, something.
Right. I'd be afraid of doing that even with that. Even if you put me to sleep, I'd still be like, oh, shoot.
These were, a lot of agricultural, like they knew how to castrate animals anyway. Like this is just not, this is another topic. It maybe wasn't that bad is my point. But
I got to give a shout out to your book real quick because everyone can tell you a thing or two. Okay. So please go get her book. Your book in particular, I don't want to get lost on that, but this is like a shameless plug in the midst of our Paul here. The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. In this, you talk about how we need to kind of get rid of the romanticizing or oral tradition approach. Not saying there weren't oral traditions, but it's like, this is not like a testable, observable phenomena that we can actually try to find out what the criteria of the Gospels is. And you're saying that it looks like Gospels are similar to what the Greco-Roman elites were writing in and competing in that kind of literature. You really need to get this book. Did I conceptualize that like in somewhat close or?
Yeah, definitely. So what I'm trying to argue in that book is that we spend a lot of time in the field trying to get back to the origins of Christianity and imagining that the Gospels, and this may be a little aspirational, are representative of an oral tradition that was passed on by generations after generations of early Christians and contains, we put in a lot of effort to figure out, what elements are historical. And to what extent they represent communities. So often you hear about the Markan community, the Matthean community, the Lucan community, and this idea that the Gospels and anything that they share in terms of literary material must be representative of a shared oral tradition. That strategically works very well for achieving that goal of coming up with some kind of origin for Christianity. What I point out in the book is that that seems to be a very, as you referenced, romantic idea. And I actually mean that not only in our kind of colloquial sense of romantic, but it's a methodology for approaching the Gospels that I identify goes back to the Romantic period. So 17th, 18th, 19th century, when that was a way that a lot of people approached the ideas of literature in general, that authors can be literate spokespersons for whole elements of culture or whole peoples. And when you look at the way that Greek and Roman literature was produced in the ancient world, that's not usually how we describe these things. We don't talk about, I think I give the examples in the book of like Virgil's community, or Philo's community. We don't usually attribute literature to communities. And so I go through the book and try to demonstrate that what you have, I don't think, is the evidence of shared oral traditions, but actually 3 authors in the Synoptic Gospels in particular, where people are exchanging literature. They're exchanging texts, and individual authors are actually trying to come up with their own best version of the story. And you can see other elements throughout the Gospels that are shared in Greco-Roman literature broadly. So I point out that there are elements of the Gospels, that stories even about things like the Last Supper or the crucifixion, that are in texts like the Satyricon. So I kind of go through and or in things like biographies of Plutarch. Now, the idea that the Gospels share things in common with other kinds of literature, like ancient biography or the Greek novel, or even philosophy, things like that, that's not new. But when you think about it in the context of the Gospel authors as normal authors in the ancient world who are just writing stories, it, I think, shifts that frame from imagining the Gospels as these, representative of an oral tradition and a literate spokesperson who's just recording the stories of the church about the historical Jesus. It shifts that frame, and I try to point out that actually these authors are just kind of writing another story in the ancient world.
I do want everybody to go down in the description. The book is down there. Please get you a copy. I will come back to this at the end of our episode for sure. And then also, if I may, I want everybody to also check out MythVision's Patreon. I work very hard. Please consider joining us there. I mean, this is a middle of the episode, just plug. Working very hard. Every month I get, people who come and go, and it's hard to keep the numbers up. I am trying to do new things, trying to, keep growing what I'm doing here. But I had one video, like a clip, if I could, to play for you, that I kind of think of Paul in, right? Because I've had these conversations where, did Paul believe there was a historical Jesus? He doesn't really care to talk much about Jesus's actual life. And this is a few questions before we get to the super chats. I am going to get to the super chats. We could do one on historical Jesus in the future, but just like, did Paul think there was a guy? And did Paul learn anything from the previous community? Because he talks about, I got my gospel from no human source, Galatians. He loves to do that. And I think he probably did get some of this stuff from earlier people, especially if he says he's persecuting them, whatever that even means. I don't necessarily think it means kill, but I think it could mean
annoying.
Yeah, there's a problem. He's reporting them. He's trying to get them in trouble, whatever it might be. So let me play the Passion Translation for those who aren't aware. Brian Simmons is a modern guy who translates the Bible, right? And let's hear how he describes this. And tell me if you think Paul's kind of working in the same gist here. Thank you, Stephen, my buddy Stephen, for introducing this little clip to me. Here we go.
That miracle.
Okay, 2009. Brian Simmons gets a new assignment. What happened?
Jesus Christ came into my room. He breathed on me. And he commissioned me.
When he breathed on you, I have to ask you this. What did it feel like?
Good question.
It felt like a kiss from heaven. It felt like heaven's wind, the ruach, the breath, the wind of God. It came upon me. And he spoke to me and said, I'm commissioning you to translate the Bible into the translation project that I'm giving you to do. And he promised that he would help me, and he promised me he would give me secrets of the Hebrew language.
It's starting to sound like Paul, but we're not done yet. Just wanted to tease you.
Do you believe he blew on you? There was an impartation for revelation.
I do. I believe the spirit of revelation was given. And I have to say, when he breathed on me, in no way would I want to compare that to...
So he goes to say, I don't compare it to the canon, because of course that's going to get him in the hot seat with Christians. But he wants to make sure he sells his version of this translation that God imparted on him by breathing upon him. Paul says he got his gospel from no human source, from no man, from scripture and revelation. But does that mean he learned nothing about Jesus? but direct scripture and revelation? Or did Paul learn about Jesus probably from Cephas, the list in 1 Corinthians 15, or these other people he's persecuting? What makes more sense?
I think he thinks he's getting it from the risen Christ. That's what he
Okay.
describes. So he described, I mean, even I know just full disclosure, you texted me right before this saying you wanted to talk about the Last Supper.
I did.
So I can bring that in here. So this is a good example of what I think is going on. He keeps talking about how he has what you might call divination experiences, or these revelatory experiences where the risen Christ is appearing to him and telling him stuff. Now, one of the things, among the things that the risen Christ tells him, is about the last meal that he had with his followers before his crucifixion. And this is not coming from anybody who was there, other than the risen Jesus telling him these things. He's basically doing what you just showed in that clip. Someone saying, he appeared to me, he told me this. Now, think about why he has to do this. Okay, like let's grant that he thinks this is happening. Okay, whatever. I don't, psychologically sure, cognitively sure, something like that seems to be happening to him. But also, if you think about it as a strategic measure, and I'm not attributing, this to him in some kind of cynical way, but as strategy, this guy was not there, right? Paul was not there. In fact, he tells us he has a very different background to this whole Jesus movement, where he, was formerly again persecuting. Why would anybody listen to him if he's not one of the people who is there or was there? And I think it's because he can claim, well, sure, James and Peter were there, but Jesus talked to me more recently. Like, yeah, you knew the guy, but who cares about whether or not you knew the guy? Like, what matters is Christ Jesus. What matters is the resurrected Jesus. And that's the guy who's coming to me because I'm the prophet chosen by God to bring the Gentiles into the fold so that the end time comes and that we can fulfill, this destiny. And so as a matter of strategy, to be an apostle who's a member of this group, to have any kind of authority, he claims authority in various ways. One is that he is a Pharisee, so he understands the scriptures really well. But the other is that he's talking to resurrected Jesus on the regular. You know what I mean? Like he's been chosen to receive this intel from the risen Christ and to communicate it. And that gives him authority that you can argue even supersedes that of Jesus's followers, those that we know are still alive. Does that make
No, I get it. Yeah, I always thought when I read 1 Corinthians 11 in that place on the night he was handed over.
Yeah.
This happens before. I was thinking maybe Paul picked up on this from earlier Christians. This is what I was thinking, because he lists earlier Christians in that 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah.
It's like he appeared to them. Like, I imagine this appear may mean Paul's trying to say, hey, I got similar. I'm the most up to date, and I worked harder than all of them. Of course, he has to add that caveat after he lists them.
Of course.
But it seemed like to me he's kind of trying to imply, like, hey, look, on the night he was handed over. And I asked that question because in the mythicist model that says Jesus didn't exist at all and he was only a heavenly figure, which means they say that they believe Paul and then believed he existed, but only in heaven. Never did he come to earth. I thought maybe the night that he was handed over passage might have implied here is something that Paul's picking up on, maybe from earlier Christians, and there's a ceremonial meal. But do you think Paul is the one who's coming up with the ceremonial meal for Jesus? Okay. Yeah. Now, what do we do about those who he appeared to before Paul? Like, would you say it's the same kind of appearance? Or is Paul making this up to add to his credentials? Or
I mean, like he talks about the Jerusalem Council too. Like he links himself with the movement. He's just establishing himself as a different figure in a different key, but he is signaling some kind of, overall movement. He's not denying that. But I think he's giving himself some kind of authority through different means. You see what I mean?
Got it.
So the reason I say to, this Last Supper, which is not what it was called, but we know what we mean when we say Last Supper. But the reason I point that out is an example of this idea of, he says like, well, Jesus came to me. Sometimes I say this to my students. I don't mean to sound too flippant, but I sometimes say zombie Jesus just to designate, like the resurrected Jesus from the historical Jesus. So when he says, zombie Jesus told me about this meal, and then it appears later on in the Gospels, what that signals to me is that the Gospel writers read Paul more so than, it's quite possible, to your point, that there was some kind of, and if you read, I have, which I brought a Bible just in case, I have the Harper Collins here.
Hallelujah.
If you look at, if you read like the notes when you get to a passage about the Last Supper, it'll say like, oh, here are all the cross references. And it'll say that, well, there must have been an oral tradition from the beginning of the Jesus movement that made it to Paul and then made it to each community of the gospel writers. So that must mean it's true, because it's like you can't conceptualize or there's a resistance to the idea that Paul just made it up, right? Like that Paul, or this was a divination experience, whatever validity you want to give to a divination experience, but it's quite possible he just had a divination experience where Jesus told him this took place.
Well, this, if I may, I got a jab. This is fun. So for me, Brian Simmons, right? The guy we just saw the video on, who talked about, and the Lord he breathed on me and it felt like a kiss from heaven. And look, the guy may or may not have had an experience. I don't rule it out. And I don't say he didn't. People have it. The human brain and humans are weird.
That's kind of what I was saying before when I was like, sure, it happened. Like that's not my job.
Right.
Give him an MRI. It's not.
But I wanted to ask you, being someone who's aware of Paul and the Greco-Roman world, he's not an idiot. He knows there are mystery cults out here that are part of religious systems. It's not like the cult is different from the religion. The cult kind of is emphasizing, here's the mythological story of Isis, Osiris, or whatever it might be, Dionysus. Sure. He knows. And I'm thinking to myself, is Paul this guy who's engaging in the Gentile world? He sees this. Some of these people are probably members of these mystery religions. And here he is going, oh, guess what? Jesus also had, but this is the true one, has a meal as well. The Jerusalem Council probably didn't do that, I would think.
Well, it's possible, but this is one of those things where it would be awfully hard to decisively reconstruct, right? So I'm just dealing with what I see in the letters and kind of, Occam's razor, like what makes if I'm just taking everything at face value, like what is being communicated here. The thing is, I might have mentioned this last time, so I apologize if I'm sort of repeating myself, but some of it's a little bit later, 2nd century, but we have a lot of accounts, and the one that's popping into my head at the moment is Lucian, about a couple of things. One is somebody like Lucian who's writing satire, so you have to take it with kind of a grain of salt because he's trying to be funny, basically. Right. But he describes other figures who are competing with each other in what we might call kind of this Greco-Roman system, where they're claiming that they are basically channeling the Greco-Roman gods. And so the one that comes to mind for me is this guy named Alexander, who was supposed to be channeling the god Glycon. And so he would do all kinds of things. Like he would write like little predictions, for people. He would write them in meter and sell them. Or people would come to him, and he had a snake puppet. This is why I like this guy. He would set up a tent, and he had a little snake puppet that had like a little, it was like a I can't say this word.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So people would line up and pay money to come in to ask a question about their lives. And he had this little ventriloquist,
what
snake
did you say?
Yeah, exactly. So but he was speaking for the god. And then he eventually, he claims he had a daughter with the moon. And so he marries her off to a Roman senator who just happens to be bankrolling this whole thing. You know what I mean? You have lots of examples. And again, you have to moderate your expectations with that kind of comparative evidence, because in this case, Lucian is being look at this guy, he's not, but we know that guy existed because the emperor asked him questions. He got popular enough, right? That we have some evidence that, independent of this kind of satirical treatment. So there are certainly people even in the ancient world who treat all of this stuff with a healthy dose of skepticism, let's say.
Right.
So you have lots of figures like that in the ancient world. And so I think, Paul is just another one of these guys, mostly guys. And then the other thing about the meal is John Kloppenborg's recent book on Christ associations. What he does a nice job demonstrating in that book is that, there weren't, I hope this, I'm not trying to say this is John's argument. This is kind of my summation of it. And it might be a little too simplistic, so I apologize in advance. But essentially what he's saying is, there were no ancient like fire departments. There were no ancient like undertakers. When you had to have some kind of, public works done, generally speaking, or something like taking care of a family after somebody's departed, you often needed some kind of group to help with that. And so when you have these associations, ecclesia, which is the word in Greek that we translate as church, ecclesia as a word existed well before Paul, because it represented these kind of social organizations that would band together. Usually it's because everybody was part of the same kind of profession, almost like a guild, or also almost like a union that would get together. Everybody would kind of contribute money, and there would be some kind of god as a spokesperson for it, a representative for that ecclesia. The god would be, so like, we're the ecclesia for the fire department in Ostia, and our, patron god is X, Y, and Z, right? Usually it would just be one or two. So Paul has that in mind too. He chooses the word ecclesia. These people are supposed to be taking care of each other. They're supposed to be helping each other out. Like if there's a widow in the community, if there's, somebody who needs to be buried, like everybody bands together, everybody's kind of paying their dues. Part of those associations, you had communal meals. We know this. There were like receipts, right? Like other ecclesia for other purposes. People would get together, like somebody would donate like the donkeys to bring in the food. Like we have evidence for this, and Kloppenborg's done a nice job showing this. So the idea that Paul would be like, we need to have like a family meal. Jesus came to me and said, you know what? I did that right before I died. His death is really big and important in this movement. So, we're going to replicate the meal he just told me about. Everybody pull your money together. We're going to share in this Eucharistic meal, as part of this participation in Christ. We're going to share in this meal. We're going to baptize. This is how you're going to receive God's pneuma. That's how you're going to be one of the group. We're going to help one another out. We're gonna share in Christ's pneuma. We're going to be pneuma. We're going to be in Christ, and that's what's going to bound us together while we wait for this end time scenario to take place. So it just is a normal kind of social behavior to me. It's not super unique in the group. Do you see what I mean? Like it's not.
Absolutely. I have one question. I'm going to shut up after this. I want our super chats. Super chat your questions. We'll get into those. I really appreciate you being patient with me. We're having a blast. I really wanted you to kind of give us.
I'm also talking too much today. I've had too much tea.
This is good. Trust me. I'm talking too much because you should do all the talking, honestly. Paul, when he says Christ was buried, he's crucified, buried, right? People die on this little buried. Well, buried means, look at Mark, in a tomb. And then others will say, no, that historically would have never happened. If he was a criminal, he'd have been left up on a cross and rotted, even though maybe there were certain special laws that Rome allowed Judea to kind of potentially, I don't know. My point is Bart Ehrman thinks he died and rotted on a cross, I guess. Others think he had like a burial that was like a criminal burial. And then there's me who comes in, and I'm not any of these, but I think I'm like, okay, let me weigh out the evidence and think about it. Hero cults are always associated with tombs. Here you have these high epic type tales that talk about tombs in the Gospels. Does Paul think in some sense like these cult demigod gods, whatever, that this burial is like that? Is his Christ a hero epic type of figure? Or is he like, hey, he literally got killed by Romans. He literally was buried in some way. He doesn't even care to emphasize how, but he resurrected, because the point is he's alive now, and he's alive, and we are alive in him, and we'll never die with his pneuma or whatever. What's up with the burial thing, though? How do you interpret that?
Well, I actually interpret it alongside what I was just saying in terms of this idea of participation in Christ, because he often goes out of his way to be like, this is what I'm promising. To become part of this group, he's making a big promise, which is, you're going to receive a pneumatic body that never gets ill or dies and lives forever. That's pretty good. And that's kind of it's a big ask. It's a big ask for someone to be like, oh yeah, okay, I'm gonna again, this is not something that these particular Gentiles are born into so that they've heard this narrative their whole lives, right? Like this is something new to them. So it's not, native to their thinking necessarily. So it's possible he's doing something like you say, appealing to some idea of hero cult or something like that. The only reason I resist that to some extent is because he tends to be more of a philosopher. I don't see a lot of evidence of the hero cult in Paul. I could be wrong about that. But I think we tend to sometimes too in modernity, because of distance, sort of merge Roman and Greek as if it's one thing and it's very, very different.
Right. Because that's a Greek idea. I get it.
Yeah. But, at the same time, Paul is really in, Western Asia and Greece. And so, yeah, maybe regionally that would have made a lot of sense. In something like 1 Corinthians, 15:4 or something like that, where he talks about buried. I think it's right at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
He just kind of names it, if I remember correctly, in like a list. Like,
right.
He always talks about like, and we're going to die with him. Like in all the list of the things that we're going to do with Christ, we're going to resurrect with him. We're going to die with him. We eat with him in this meal. We do X, Y, Z, and die and bury. Like these are all the ways that we participate in Christ in the way, that we're all part of the same unit. And so to me, when he says, and he died and he was buried, that's what's going to happen to all of us. Right. And so it's almost like he's acknowledging that, that this is the human condition. At the time he's writing Corinthians, people are dying who are a part of this group. And the other people in the group are like, like you said, he was coming back.
Right. So now he has to backpedal and make sense of that. And when he comes, those of us who are alive and remain at his coming will be.
Yeah, because he talks about the people who are buried who are going to rise, right? He has to address these issues because they're issues within the groups of Gentiles he's writing to. Like what's going to happen. He talks about baptism of the dead, I think, isn't on 1 Corinthians, right? So This is a pressing issue in these, again, the nature of the occasional letter. We have to reconstruct what the problems were that they're coming to him with. And, Corinthians have a lot of problems. We can talk about the Corinthian problems. But, in 1 Corinthians 15, he's really getting into like, okay, let me break this down for you. This is what you can expect. And so when he says, like he was crucified, he died, he was buried. Those are the things, that are going to happen this is how we're all participating in Christ, to me.
Thank you. Yeah. I think there's so much that could be said too about that whole participation. Like here is the script of what happened to Jesus. We need to follow that script. By baptism, you are buried. We're going to resurrect, of course, with the pneuma, the spirit that comes into you. You're also going to rise. So here's this like prescript that you're going to also mimic. He doesn't go into the details. He just doesn't give you what the Gospels do is something completely different.
Oh, yeah. And, I wrote about that in the book a little bit, where, why put him in a tomb? Like in the Greek novel, there are empty tombs all the time to symbolize, in the Satyricon, the same thing. It symbolizes a change in ontological status. You are no longer mortal. You have become divine. There's, is it Keraton maybe? If that's wrong, my apologies, because I didn't reread it before coming. But there's one that I quote, one of the Greek novels, where the main protagonist, is looking for his lost love. He thinks that she's dead in a tomb. It's a very Romeo and Juliet kind of story. And he goes into the tomb. She was, of course, alive and pirates took her. This might be Calaroe. And he goes in, and the first thing he says when he sees that her body is missing is like, oh, what God came and took her, to make her a goddess now, like up in heaven. Like that was the apotheosis, right? Like, so
right.
To symbolize the change in ontological status of someone from mortal to immortal, their body has to go away. And there are so many examples in the ancient world. And to the extent, that I have argued that the Gospels represent strongly what, a little sloppily we might call Greco-Roman literature, but literature that's popular in the 1st and 2nd centuries, to the extent that it represents and mirrors that kind of practice and that content. The idea that Jesus, you would roll away the stone and the body would be gone. That's spot on. That's like, yeah.
I hope the apologists are taking notes. Now we're going to super chats. I'm sorry for taking so long to get to this point. We're almost okay. at an hour almost. Idiosyncrasy, thank you for the super sticker. I did not see a comment from you, my friend. Thank you so much, though, for the support. I really appreciate it. Doc Pleuromanot. Oh, snap. Doc's in the house. Ancient rhetoricians said good arguments are based on logos, pathos, and ethos. Paul exhibited few examples of personal emotion in his letters, box checking by relying on his hardships to evoke empathy in his readers.
Personal emotions, I think he does a fair amount. Now, this brings up some interesting questions about, psychological profiles of our authors. In Romans, he engages in something called prosopopoeia. And there are 2 scholars who have written about this quite convincingly. Stan Stowers and Emma Wasserman have written about this quite a bit. But he often takes on characters, and he'll speak. Prosopopoeia means speech and character. So he'll often say things like in Romans, I think it's around Romans 5 maybe, he'll say things like, oh, why can't I follow the law? Like, why am I so bad at this? And then he'll be like, kind of do question and answer. But you get the sense there that he's describing through this rhetorical means a certain emotional state. It may not be one that we want to attribute to him as like a psychological profile, again, of the man. And so to that extent, I understand the question. He isn't exactly demonstrating pathos in a way that seems confessional. But he talks about his own experiences. He uses those rhetorical moves to evoke emotion, to be convincing. He certainly shows anger. He has no problem with anger. Back to, Galatians and threatening people with castration. So I think that, he often will say things like, you foolish Galatians. Like, I can't believe you. I think the only one letter I can think of where he's actually kind of not angry or doesn't get emotional in some ways, Romans, because he doesn't know them. When he writes a letter to the Romans, he's heard about them, and he's been, again, kind of in West Asia and Greece, and he wants to go to Rome, and tradition holds that he makes it there, and that's kind of where his story ends. I think the church says that he's executed in Rome. We don't really know what happens to him. But when he writes to the Romans, he's like, here's my deal. Actually, when I teach Paul, I start with Romans, even though it's what some people call his mature theology. It's so later theology after, about 15 years. It's like his intellectual CV, because he hasn't met them yet. And he's trying to convince them not only to pay for him to come to Rome, but to then pay for him to go to Spain. And so he's looking for sponsorship. And so he has to lay out, like, here's my deal. Wow. So that's the only one where I don't totally, like, he'll use something like prosopopoeia, that speech and character that has that emotional tinge to it. But otherwise, like, yeah, he shows emotion. He gets mad. He definitely gets mad.
Thank you so much for that. Gnostic informant, my buddy Neil, that you absolutely must get up with and do some interviews with. What are your thoughts on the writer of Acts claiming that Paul was raised at the feet of Gamaliel? I hope I pronounced his name right.
That's one of those elements, like I was saying before, that fill in the biography of Paul, but probably serve later purposes. So, like I mentioned before, that Acts claims he's from Tarsus. Sure, maybe, except he only ever describes himself around Damascus. But, it's one of those things like, yeah, maybe, probably has a different purpose to it that has more to do with whatever's going on in the 2nd century and beyond.
Neil, thanks for that super chat, my friend, and for being a member of our YouTube channel.
I'll email you back.
Yeah. Doc Pleuromanot, thank you for the super chat. Acts 15:15. James argues for Peter's baptism of non-Jews and cites Simeon, and the rare verb symphonia is used with the prophets Amos a blatant refutation of Paul's redefinition of Israel and advocating for James' Davidic restoration. We didn't prep for this, Doc. Let me pull it up and just kind of read the passage, if that helps any. But obviously you need Greek and... Anyway.
I'm not sure what the question is. Hold on. That's on me. Blatant refutation of Paul's redefinition of Israel. Yeah, I would have to look at the passage. That's one of those things that a scholar of Acts, should really address, because I'm not a scholar of Acts, because I don't consider it historical
right.
at all. So whatever's going on in terms, okay, I'm pulling it up now. 15:15.
Yeah, but it's just a phrase.
Finish speaking, James replied, my brothers, listen to me. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, so it's going back to what I was saying before. God first looked favorably on the Gentiles, and is trying to bring them back.
Right. From
I'm not
that point,
sure.
You were saying like they fell away long ago. After they finished speaking, James replied, brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree. So, okay, this is just dealing with that. Cornelius was just joining the movement. And I guess I'm trying to figure out what the point of the super chat is.
That's what I was saying. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. It might just kind of be an assertion of the point, that, the idea of Israel is going to include the Gentiles again. But that was always the case. That was always the purpose. The Gentiles have fallen away and they have to come back. A blatant refutation of Paul's redefinition of it. So I think there, I'm not sure what's meant by Paul's redefinition of Israel. What I see going on in 15:15 is directly from Paul's letters.
Okay. Yeah, I just know Paul does some fishy stuff with the way he even uses the phrase in Galatians about Abraham. But it's also a common thing. I was reading a book, Cattell Berthelot. I don't know if you've heard of her. She wrote a book called Jews and the Roman Rivals, which I brag about a lot because I really enjoyed it. It's the idea that Jews, this wasn't a Christian thing. A lot of even Jewish apologists that I've had on who like to jab at Paul. Oh, he's so anti, this and that. But Jewish rabbis and writers were already trying to redefine being an Abraham's descendant. And they were like, well, the term in the Bible is the Gentile or Goyim, right? So he'd be the father of many Goyim. Who were the Goyim? Duh, non-Jew. So Abraham would be their fathers too. This is prophesied here in Genesis. And so they're already utilizing that language and redefining it for the contemporary audience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, we're all God's people, and so just some have fallen away. And, Paul argues about this. I think it is actually in Galatians where he described, we're all children of Abraham, just some are from Sarah and some are from Hagar. And so he uses this to create this idea of, he talks about the adoption of the Spirit. These Gentiles just have to be adopted back into the line of Abraham. That's how he talks about it in his letters. And it doesn't mean that, but again, this is predicted that they will come back. And he talks about those who participate in baptism and coming back, adopted by the pneuma, by the Spirit, back into that family tree of Abraham, as kind of the legitimate heirs of the promise. When he talks about that, and he uses that kind of language, all of it is wrapped up in this idea that they are then going to be co-heirs with Christ, is what he says. Brothers in Christ. When he says brother and sister in the text, he's actually just using Adelphoi, so he's using just brothers. But the idea is that, Jesus receives that pneumatic body from God. He's an adopted son of God. Jesus is. This brings up the gospel question. When does Jesus actually become the Son of God? Is it at the baptism that's described in the Gospels? Because in Mark, it kind of seems like he's just a dude until he's baptized, and then God's pneuma comes down and then makes him God's son, right?
Right.
Whether or not Paul thinks that this was something predestined, I don't think so, actually. I think Paul, I'd have to, read around and think about this a little bit more. But like what's in my heart is that Paul thinks that, Jesus has been selected. Maybe he was somewhat, we might use the word like preordained to this position, kind of the way that like, I think Paul says like, well, I was going to be a prophet, like that was predetermined by God, like before my birth, right? Like he may have an idea of who is designated for these roles. He does not seem to have much of the like Mary Virgin kind of thing going on. So this idea that you can receive God's pneuma, and that's going to change again in Jesus's case, like his status as a son of God, but also his ontological status. That's the thing that people are participating in, the Gentiles, by becoming what he calls co-heirs with Christ. So you become a co-heir by being baptized because you receive that same pneuma. That pneuma is the stuff that turned Jesus into God's son. It's now going to turn you into an adopted child of Abraham. So that makes you like Jesus's brother. That means we're all brothers in Christ. Like, so you can see how the language, like all of that should sound vaguely familiar formulaically. Yeah. But in the Greek, that's all very well established, those terms, and they've become formulaic to us, but it's part of his strategy of describing these things.
Thank you so much for that. Constellation Pegasus, in today's terms, could Paul be considered a cult leader then? Seems to be a suspect in Judaism and researchers on the Bible.
It's a very good question. The thing I struggle with a little bit, and it would be interesting to talk to other Pauline scholars about this, is to what extent Paul's so-called like apocalypticism should play in here. I think that, to me, it's a major factor. I think it's always the elephant in the room, that this end time is coming, it's coming. And then like his letters change as time goes on to accommodate that. The idea that he would be a cult leader sounds to me, therefore, a little bit too like established, if you know what I mean. Like the idea that we have to establish a cult and a hierarchy and a formal organization sounds like the activity of people who think that they're going to be around a while. And like certainly you have some talk of hierarchy and organization and social structure in Paul, but I think you also have the idea like things are a little bit fast and loose for Paul until you start to realize people are like running too far with it, like the Corinthians, and too much time is passing. And then you start, I call it in my classes, a domestication of Paul. You start to see that he gets, like, no, don't do that. Like you don't have the pneumatic bodies yet. Like, what are you doing? Don't go to the prostitutes or like whatever it is, right? Like you can't live like it's the end time already. You start to see him kind of like, no, you have to veil your head. Like, don't look like a weirdo. Like, he's trying to balance kind of this radical change he's promising with social expectation. And as time goes on, that aperture kind of keeps closing in on him a little bit. So to me, I'm not sure if he's trying to start a cult so much. Again, like I think he just thinks this is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. And I think he thinks he's probably like the most aligned with the expectations. And if he truly believes he's seeing the resurrected Jesus and that he's a prophet, he thinks that he's doing the right thing in terms of fulfilling the destiny of the Jewish people by incorporating these Gentiles for that end time scenario. Where the idea of like cult leader may come in is to the extent that we bring in something like capitalist expectations, right? Which are just a fact of life. So back to thinking about, say, like Lucian and Alexander, that guy was definitely getting paid for what he was doing. Paul is not shy about, asking for support and taking it. That's pretty clear. He's not even writing his own letters sometimes. It seems like he may be dictating them. So somebody's doing that labor for him. And, he's looking for sponsorship. And so he still has to live, right? And again, it depends on how cynical you are. If you want to write the satire about Paul, then he's capitalizing on, this Christ cult that he was formerly persecuting and now trying to take it over, and set himself up, in counter to somebody like James and Peter, and this more maybe kind of we were talking about this at another point, like sort of upstart Jewish group within Jerusalem, right? Like he's establishing something very different and using his experience and knowledge as a Pharisee. Yeah, you can make that. The truth is probably somewhere between.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. There's so much. Thank you, Constellation, for the super chat. Battler, thank you for the super chat. Why would Paul not even show a little interest in learning about the life and teaching of Jesus Christ? Would that not be logical? Is there any ulterior motive in his trying to spread Christianity?
Does not help him at all to know anything about the historical Jesus. Does not help him in the slightest, really, because he didn't know him. And in the ancient world, you know, like how can he validate any of his claims, you know, about his knowledge if he's trying to trade on the idea of what that man said during his lifetime in an era when you can't, you know, reconstruct. There are no pictures. There's no, you know, Jesus didn't write anything down. Like there's nothing for him to go on in that respect to kind of establish his authority.
Is it fair to say that he may have known at least a teaching of Jesus dying, burying, resurrecting? Did that teaching precede him?
He does say some things about him. I should make a list someday because this comes up. But I remember the one that I often cite just because my joke. I need to get new jokes. But he does say that Jesus said, "Don't commit adultery," and I always joke, and that's the one everyone breaks. It's like the only one that the earliest. I'm joking, but you know, like just that he says a couple of things along those lines, but it's just not what's pressing for him in these letters. Now, there's the question of what he means when he says that he has a gospel. But it seems that the letters themselves may represent that gospel. Like this is the good news, which is what the term means. And then it's used later on for these writings about the historical Jesus. So yeah, he has, I mean, this is where too, you know, I'm not along the lines of scholars who are like, oh, Jesus never existed. I mean, he clearly knows James and Peter. If you want to take that testimony, like there's knowledge of the life of Jesus, but you know, one thing that I've argued elsewhere is that the life and teachings of the historical Jesus don't seem to become particularly important to what we might consider the early church until after the temple is gone. And it's after the temple is gone that you start to see people being like, what did that guy say? You know, like, what happened? How do we understand Judaism without the temple? Because if you notice, Jesus's teachings don't require the temple.
Mm-hmm. So how do we know that's really what Jesus, unless you want to try and put him into what, like a Qumran type of figure that's not needing a temple? They're already a diasporic type of Judaism, right?
And, you know, that can be an influence, certainly. But you have too, I mean, one thing I meant to bring up earlier is, you know, Paul's influence on the Gospels, I think, is immense, despite the fact that he doesn't talk about the historical Jesus, but because he lays that roadmap for things like the Last Supper. He lays that roadmap for what is ethical living, right? And, you know, how do we understand a new way to do Judaism, which Paul presents, and an evaluation of the Hebrew scriptures. The Jesus you get in the Gospels is very much, you know, we can talk more about this too if we ever do historical Jesus session.
We should.
But there's a great knowledge of Greco-Roman philosophy in the teachings of that Jesus that you get in the Synoptic Gospels, especially. And again, Paul reflects that kind of knowledge as well. And so you're getting that, I think, from, and to put those all in canon together, create a cohesion, right? To put all those early letters and then put the Gospels together. But I don't think that's not Paul's problem. You know, like strategically as an authority figure, deferring to the historical Jesus doesn't do him any good. Right. He's a divination specialist, more or less. You know, interpreting the sacred scriptures of the Jewish people and channeling knowledge from this pneumatic figure in Christ. That's what he's doing. To go back to the historical Jesus doesn't serve the purpose of either the eschatological kind of pressure that's going on and in the moment as he describes it, and then later on because he's separate from the movement in Jerusalem. it doesn't do him any good to refer back to that. He has no knowledge of it really, except for what you're pointing out here. Maybe a few things here and there, a few teachings here and there, but other than that, no.
Thank you. Scott Duke says, theological question. Would Paul have had a plaster pig on his bookshelf? Hold on, you got one right behind you. So
I do. Where is it? Yeah, that's my piggy bank. For anybody who's noticed my backdrops, I like taxidermy, and I like that kind of thing. And I got this actually at a museum on Miami Beach. So it's a mold of a dead piglet. Sorry. And it's a prized possession. It's my nice little.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott, for the super chat. Avaro says, did baptism of the dead have a pagan counterpart? And I'll tell you just a tease, like I read an article Richard Carrier recently did on he did it on Dying and Rising Gods, how there is a motif on the mythology.
That was written about that too, right?
Yeah, like in it, the Dionysus cult, he said they also had a practice where you could baptize them on behalf of the dead. But I didn't know if you knew of anything or if you were able to verify that or.
The thing that came to mind, this is probably not helpful. The thing that comes to mind for me is libations for the dead. I mean, when you think about the way that, especially in Greece, it's actually, here's a case where Greek and Roman, I think, does apply, but going to the sites of the dead and pouring libations, pouring oil, pouring water onto the graves for there's just such a long tradition in the ancient Mediterranean for this. And for, both nourishing the dead, but also, creating some kind of anointing process to be close to them. There isn't one tradition that necessarily jumps right out at me, but baptism, it doesn't seem that strange to me that would take place. Yeah.
I was reading a book called Coming Back to Life, and I'm still reading that book. Actually, one of the scholars in it, I was asking you about when I was like, hey, do you know his email? But they have these strange.
Yeah, Kaiser.
There's a porous line between the living and the dead, and they would go out there and put food on a plate or whatever and leave it out there at the grave. And they thought maybe the dead was hungry and they would eat some of it. But we even have today people who believe if you leave water out on your windowsill, the spirit of your loved one will come because they're thirsty and they'll be able to drink some of this.
We do it all the time. Yeah, we shouldn't treat the ancients they. There are different kinds of memorials that people do, but there is an idea of trying to share with the dead. And also, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about ecclesia. I'm teaching a deaf class in the fall, and I've taught it before. We're very separate from the process of death. We don't like bodily functions and modernity. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to think about death. Most of everything that we do on a day-to-day basis is trying to stave off the reality of death. And we're not part of the process generally, especially in the Western world. Somebody dies, we don't dress the body. We don't anoint the body for burial ourselves anymore. We don't, it was often the women in a family unit that took care of this. But, the family took care of the dead body. And so the idea that you would continue to have a connection to your ancestors, especially within strong family units and elite family units. This was centrally important, and people continue to have a relationship with those. There's a book actually that I assign that's on modernity to some extent, but I think it's relevant. It's by someone named Dan Forth. And it's about in rural Greece, how into the 20th century, you would bury the dead in a family tomb, wait for the body to decompose, then take the bones and put it into stack them together and put them into a family plot that is for everybody's bones. So you would even go back to the dead body and, caretake for it. So all of that, to me creates a different reality. Sorry, but I was just reading the other day, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a year after his first wife died, went and opened up the casket. Yeah. So even, and nobody's quite sure why he did. That's a whole other story. But like the idea of our connection to death and dying in modernity, especially now, is very different than even 150 years ago. But especially 2,000 years ago, when, you know, the family would have anointed the body with oil, it would have sat in the house for a few days. You know, you would have shrouded the body, had a ceremonial meal. Often they were called agape meals, love meals. You know, in celebration of the body, you would go back and tend to the grave. You know, there was a lot of caretaking that went on.
Thank you so much, Averos. John Macher, I apologize for butchering your name. Thank you for being a member. Where do we get the idea that Paul had bad eyesight?
I wonder if it's from the large letters. In one letter, he says that, look, I'm writing in my own hand and look how big it is, you know, or, you know, he often, I think in his letters occasionally makes references to himself as like, you know, I'm not a very good speaker, you know, like I'm not very, so he makes those kind of references often. So there are a lot of scholars who have done work on this, who know more, who work in the area of disability studies as well. And one you're speaking to, I think this week, Candida Moss.
Yeah.
And I would, she recently wrote, oh, hold on a second. There's a phone call coming in. She's written recently on this, so she might be a good scholar to ask about that as well.
Okay, I will. John, thank you for that super chat. Robert Herring with the super sticker. Thank you also for being a member of our YouTube channel. Festering Boyles says, why do you think the author of Mark didn't include resurrection appearances?
That's not why I think he was writing this story. I think we talked about this another time I visited, that, you know, the Gospel of Mark, I think we kind of miss how, I think I said to you before, like esoteric it is. I think I said we should hear the Twilight Zone music when we read it, because like Jesus is here, and then he's here, and then he's here, and then he's here. And it's just very, like, the whole thing is, you know, there's a guy, William Wordy, who very early on, it's attributed to him, this idea of the messianic secret in Mark. Nobody knows who he is, you know, like somewhere around, you know, the midpoint of Mark, I think one of the disciples is like, I think you might be, you know, like, who is this guy? He might be the Messiah. Like, shut up. Like the whole time Jesus is like,
yeah, I love that about Mark too, though. The demons get it, but they don't.
Gospel. Yeah, the demons are talking to him. He's like, shut up. Like, he's just, the whole thing, he's kind of like a jerk. He doesn't want anybody to know who he is. He's here, he's here, he's here. You know, it's very mysterious. So for the end to be like, and then he clarified everything by, like, you know, right. That wasn't what Mark was trying to do. I think Mark was trying to create this really, like, you know, like, you know, who is this guy kind of mystery novel. And I didn't work very well when the text became part of canon and was trying to be used to, you know, like, describe the beginnings of, like, Christianity and the historical Jesus.
Do you think Dennis McDonald might be onto something when he says, like, when Odysseus comes back, he's disguised? And no one is supposed to know, even the woman who anoints his feet, Eurycleia. He dies on the hill on this one. It's a really interesting thing. I'm convinced there's something to it. The Mary who comes and anoints Jesus' feet, and he says, wherever my gospel is told, let this be known far and wide, which in Greek would be like Eurycleia, what means like fame, far and wide and whatnot. So in the Homeric epic, here's this lady who's at Odysseus's feet, who also was the one who suckled him, you know, when he was a child, and she recognizes her master, and he's like, he's like, covers her mouth and tells her, shut up, or something, like really rude language. But then he's like, they're going to kill me. Do you think there might be some?
Sure. Yeah, because this is, you know, like, these are the kind of literary illusions that I'm interested in recreating. And, you know, there is an argument to be made that one of the motivations of the gospel authors is to kind of create a founding narrative too for this emerging movement, to whatever extent they're a part of it, right? So, you know, I've never denied that there may be some oral stories that these authors know, or that they know some other Christians, you know, or Christ followers at the time. It would be really weird if they were writing it and didn't know any, right? Yeah. But it just, you know, what I argue against in that first book is, you know, to what extent is it like the oral tradition of the community? That's the thing that I find, you know, not as convincing for what you're pointing out here. because it looks a lot more like what you're seeing from Homer, from Virgil. You know, you can see these other allusions that are not just exclusive to, say, like the Hebrew Bible.
Get the book. Get the book. Thank you so much for that festering. Eric Johnson, why don't the Gospels quote Paul?
Oh, like Paul? Well, because it's set before Paul. You know, so
they're purposely avoiding that, maybe.
No, but I think he's in it. You know, there are actually a few. The book that you just pointed out, I start with a story about that's the one about this scholar in the 19th century named Gustav Volkmar, who was ostracized for arguing that the entire characterization of Jesus in the Gospels was based on Paul. That there just wasn't enough information about the historical Jesus. So Paul's teachings, again, like the ethical principles he lays out, his interest in Greco-Roman philosophy, things like the Last Supper that he describes as a divination experience, were all taken by the gospel authors, coupled with what we were just talking about. You know, what do you do when you're writing a Greek novel or a foundational epic? You know, like what are the literary strategies of the day that, like an empty tomb, that symbolize, you know, engagement with high literate culture? So taking those two elements and putting them together. So, you know, as an ancient author writing within a particular genre, they're not there to document, you know, it seems like it is to us because we're using these texts for another purpose, right? But if you're, you know, using Paul and you're referencing the Last Supper, to my mind, you're quoting Paul.
That's what, one question in this, you're making me think of it, Eric. Thank you for the wonderful question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
It really is, because it makes me think, all right, if Jesus is created in the image of Paul, would this also explain why Jesus never has a wife? I mean,
well, I mean, what philosopher ever talks about one? I mean,
I don't know. I'm just thinking, like, maybe Paul's
you know,
like,
this is an argument about like Aristotle, right? Like he argued that women have fewer teeth than men, like when he was talking about, like, you know, women's physiology, and everyone's like, didn't he just ask Mrs. Aristotle? Like, what? Right? Like now there's some other, you know, like sexual politics going on in the ancient world here that I'm sort of aligning, but
right.
yeah, you know, like one wonders where those lines are with it, with this kind of thing. Sorry, that's kind of like
You're fine.
Most philosophers don't, you know, like you can't be spending your whole time talking about, like, you know, denying the passions, etc. I mean, Paul talks about marriage. It actually kind of does seem like there was a Mrs. Paul somewhere. You know, he does say, like, but he said maybe at some time, but he does say, like, you know, it's better to be like me, like, check me out. I'm not married. Like, it's not a problem for me. Like,
right.
My passions are under control. If you can't handle it, then get married, right? But like the true philosopher, like the true wise man, just doesn't
That's
go
what
there.
He's aiming for. Okay. Thank you so much.
So Jesus doesn't go there either, and neither did Aristotle. Or he would have asked Mrs. Aristotle about her too.
Thank you. We got a couple more, and then I'll let you go. I know we've hung around 90 minutes, so our timing is pretty good. Doc Pleuromonot, thank you again for the super chat. Paul curiously says he is of the tribe of Benjamin. How does this make sense as a term of identity, as these affiliations had long been defunct? Self-promoting historical pugnance. What's this? Pugnacious
Street cred. So yeah, that's one of the few things he says. If I'm correct, and you should double check me, you know, I could be missing something, but I think he only brings that up when he's talking about his competitors. And so he brings it up when he's like, you know, what's my pedigree? Well, I'm a Pharisee. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Like, I know my shit. Like, that's right. Basically. And the idea that these would not be operational categories, I think the problem with that is that may be kind of like a later rabbinic retrospection on, like, you know, Judaism, like the history of Judaism in this period, to be honest. And again, this could be idiosyncratic to me, but we don't know a ton about what it meant to be a Pharisee out, you know, in this period. We don't know a ton about what it meant to be a Pharisee outside of Judea in this period. We don't know a lot about the education of a Pharisee like Paul in this period, other than what, again, his letters display in terms of, like, he's a better letter writer than most. he's clearly a native Greek speaker who knows Greco-Roman philosophy, right? So we can draw a bunch of conclusions from that. And so as a part of that, for him to kind of to put this forward as part of his, again, like a search for authority, it must have meant something. And even if it was like a little bit nebulous to those who heard it, it certainly was establishing him as having some kind of like legitimate pedigree to the kind of claims that he was making, beyond, the idea that he's a Pharisee and interpreter of scripture. So I think it is an affiliation that is serving a purpose. It has a strategic purpose for him, and seems to have meaning when he uses it.
Thank you so much for that answer, Doc. Thanks for that super chat. Avro says, did Paul believe Jesus was pre-existing divine being, a God angel, a la Philippians 2:6-7, also 1 Corinthians 10:4? Would James, etc., come to believe the same?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. Thanks for the question. I think it's possible. This comes back to this idea of like, when did he become the Son of God? I think I would have to look at those passages again, just to really analyze it in a deep way. But the idea that Jesus was kind of predestined or designated for this particular role in the history of mankind or humankind, that makes sense to me as something that would square with Paul's strategies about God's work in human history. Do you see what I mean? Like that God predetermines these roles. So again, like Paul thinks that he was predetermined to have this role. And so that works in that respect. I'm much more interested personally in how he thinks this is all going to square at the end. Because once Jesus is resurrected, has that pneumatic body, the language is very militaristic. This idea that he's going to come with an angelic army. So I'm kind of segueing to something I'm working on right now, which is through Paul, especially in 1 Corinthians, how he's describing basically this kind of end time fight with a bunch of angels, how it's going to work. And there was this idea that there are these kind of, what was the term, like divine beings that existed. Sometimes the term used is something like daimons, but these intermediate beings, divine beings. And usually from the Greek and Roman philosophers to Paul, they're described as existing in this region that's below the moon, so somewhere between the earth and the moon. And the moon in both Greek, Roman, and even to some extent Jewish imagination is understood as kind of like a clearinghouse for souls. And so there's this region between the earth and the moon, which is also where it seems, based on some of the language that Paul uses about like the ether and the pneuma, and like actually just kind of the pragmatic sort of physics of the whole thing that he describes. Like it's coming primarily, I think, from his knowledge of Stoicism in this period. There do seem to be these ideas, and there's a woman named Karen O'Malley who's written on this. She wrote a book called The Moon in Greek and Roman Imagination, which I can't recommend more. It's like
gosh, I got to write this down.
And that's where some of this is coming from.
My wife's going to kill me. I've been buying too many books.
I know, and it's a Cambridge book too, but I think it's in paperback now.
Okay, I'll have to get it to you afterward. Afterwards, I got to get that. I'll add it to the description or something.
This book, The Moon in Greek and Roman Imagination, talks about all of this kind of, phenomenologically through the ancient Mediterranean. But that region below the moon, between the earth and the moon, that's where these kind of divine spirits and daimons live. And it seems to me, and so this is, again, something I'm working on right now, that Paul understands this, he engages this, and thinks that both, this resurrected Jesus and his divine army are kind of like waiting. This is why I referenced Bowie. It's very much like, Starman waiting in the sky, he's going to come down with his divine army and tackle this. This whole problem of the archons of the age. So I think that kind of idea that there are these spirits, pre-existing divine beings like that's totally operational, and I could see that.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for that question. Thank you for ranting on that. Like I know that it's like, we're at the end of the hour. I feel bad for everybody who has not tuned in to watch this. I'm sorry. Anyone who's into this kind of material, they were not on the front row seats actually listening to this, I'm sorry, you did not get to witness this. We have a metaphorical, lighter, and we're just, this is amazing. This is awesome. Like, I love this. I really do. Thank you for your time. Scott Duke says, what reference talks about the ecclesia outside of the Bible?
Like a million gajillion. So
it's a Greek term. So yeah.
Yeah, I would look into the book I referenced before, John Kloppenborg's Christ Associations. He goes through inscriptions and papyri that's documented this, and if we're talking about literary references, they're out there. John has, this book is a doorstop. It's, I I reviewed it at SPL last November. It's really it's one of those kinds of, you look at it and you're just like, oh God, only a scholar who with as many years as he has had acquiring this knowledge and these sources could put something like this together. It's a real service to the field, and it goes through a lot of these examples.
Yeah, and I've heard that before as well. So I added the moon. I just called it the Moon Book. It's in the description. It's in my Amazon recommended list for MythVision books. There's a lot of books in there. So
yeah, her name, she's Irish, and so the spelling of O'Malley is like N-I-M-H. That's the one. Yeah. So even though
excellent
book.
So that's something to work off of, because we are going to be wanting to read yours, or at least the chapter that you're going to be, or article, whatever you publish.
There is a chapter and an article. They're on their way. So these things take a little while, but it's written, so it'll be out soon.
Well, they have plenty of work they can get into right here that even deals with a lot of the things we're talking about today in Paul, but how the Gospels, what's up with the Gospels. In fact, to tease our audience, there will be an upcoming debate / discussion. I don't know how we want to organize it, but keep in mind, on my channel, everything is extremely formal and respectable. I'm not into Jerry Springer fights and stuff. My dad watched that growing up. I never really cared for it much, but professional disagreements and discussions where my buddy, Jonathan Sheffield, who I love to death, he's a wonderful Christian buddy of mine. He thinks that the gospel authors are the disciples, or at least the more traditional approach, right? And you might be coming on, fingers crossed, to have that kind of conversation. And let's see what happens in the evidence of what can we know, right? How can we base it on the evidence? Go get her book if you want salvation, right? I'm literally offering you salvation for her book. Like, you go buy it, you will cleanse yourself. It's like baptism, but better. Gotta get it.
Try.
Seriously though, I do have a few more super chats that slid in. Can we get these real fast?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Totally
Okay.
Fine.
Avaros.
No
again,
text. I just checked. No text from daycare. Everybody's good.
That's always a good thing. I always try to.
Yeah,
respect
it's
your
raining,
time.
but I haven't seen any tornadoes. We're good.
You're still alive. Avaros' messianic secret in Mark is about keeping the nature and function of Jesus, sacrificial Son of Man, hidden from heavenly powers, or they will not kill him, thwarting God's plan of redemption as per 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, often it's described as a strategy of the text that, the second he's revealed, he will be crucified, and he's trying to delay that. Some people also talk about, back to this idea of pathos, that, Jesus seems to be, I think sometimes the term used as reluctant Messiah. Like, he knows what's coming and he's like, oh, okay, he doesn't want to do it. And basically, after that midpoint where he's revealed, then, some people describe Mark as sort of like a long death march with like a little preface to it. Because it starts with his baptism, and basically he's on his way to Jerusalem the entire time to kind of fulfill this thing that he knows he needs to fulfill. So yeah, the spirits know him, the demonic spirits, but also whenever he heals somebody, with the exception of the hemorrhaging woman, I think, of Mark 5, but generally speaking, when he heals people in Mark, the word in Greek is basically like bad pneuma. So there's bad pneuma in people that talk to him, and his good pneuma, or sometimes dunamis, his power, is what can displace that bad pneuma. And so as he goes through the text, that's how he's actually performing his miracles, especially the healing miracles, is he's replacing the bad pneuma with good, or talking to it. So non-human entities can recognize him and speak to him, and it demonstrates his, divine status or his spiritual status in the text. And so, but once the earthly figures begin to acknowledge who he is, earthly rulers recognize who he is, whether we're talking about, Jewish authorities or Roman authorities. Once that's recognized, that's when he gets himself into some trouble. So the Messianic secret is about keeping his status, his supernatural. I don't like to use supernatural because it's all natural. It's all part of the natural world.
Right.
But keeping that special status kind of under wraps because people aren't going to understand it. The other theological question that sometimes comes up with this is basically does he want to do this in the first place? You know what I mean? That becomes a major factor. And then you get some later traditions, things like Docetism, that are trying to figure out was he really a real person the whole time? Was he spiritual? You know what I mean? Those issues start to come up too, in a kind of similar vein to trying to figure out, his nature and purpose.
Interesting question, and well put on the response. It makes me think of this idea of mythicism, just to make a comment, where they talk about these the archons of this age, that they will argue these aren't human entities, they're all demons or some type of spiritual entities, right? But in Mark, the spiritual entities, if I could use the term, recognize Jesus. So it's so my question is I guess there's always a way to wiggle out of this, but for me, it's the humans seem to not get who he is, but even the spiritual demons do.
Well, that's kind of the point. The earthly archons and earthly beings can't conceptualize this power of who he is, right? They can't, because once they recognize that he is powerful, divine, again, dunamis, the word in Greek is the word that's used, that he is powerful, Son of God, predicted Messiah, all those, whatever term you want to use. Once they realize that, they want to tap it down, they don't understand it. And so he's sort of functioning on that plane of he can talk to spirits, he can talk to the powers, to the things that are beyond human comprehension. And because, the human beings are generally afraid. So the other theological question that comes up with this is how much is this, again, predetermined, right? He seems to be aware that the second I reveal who I am, I know what's going to happen. Human beings can't handle this, the archons of this age can't handle this, meaning the human beings who are in a ruling position will not tolerate, him taking over some kind of authority, and so the authorities of the age are going to kill him. But that's so this is what, actually, back to Paul, is what he talks about in terms of not only having seen the resurrected Jesus as proof of the end of this age, the coming new age, that these archons of the age will be defeated by the coming Messiah. Part of that is that he describes it as Jesus's faithfulness in that plan is what made this all possible. That he had his faithfulness. Often it gets translated, actually, it's the difference. This is Stanley Stauer's work as well. It's a difference between a subjective and objective genitive in Greek. So is he the subject or the object of the faith, Jesus? And often in English, in our Bibles in English today, regardless of translation, it's often described as faith in Jesus is the reason all of this took place. That is not what the Greek says. The Greek actually says it's Jesus's faithfulness that made this all possible. And we know this because whenever Paul talks about Moses's faithfulness, Abraham's faithfulness, any other prophet's faithfulness, any other Jewish figure, it's always the faithfulness of that Jewish figure ushered in that new age, that kind of progression of history. And now it's Jesus's faithfulness that this whole predicted plan of the crucifixion, resurrection will bring into place this new age. It's Jesus's faithfulness in that plan that's made this all possible. And then Paul's own faithfulness and God's plan to, graft in the Gentiles back into the family tree of Abraham is part of it too. but it's Jesus's faithfulness in this plan. And so what Mark does is demonstrate that it's Jesus's commitment to the plan, even if he's a reluctant Messiah, even if there's a messianic secret, however you want to describe what you see as that conflict. In Mark, it squares with Paul in that, there's a faithfulness to that plan, and even if he didn't like it, like he did it, and he goes along with it, but he knew what would happen once he revealed who he was.
Thank you. Wow, we could go. There's so much here. Can she explain the kick the goads? Paul took it. I think it's that. And thank you for the super chat. I think it's
Thank
the
you.
idea.
Sorry that my answer was, I don't know what kick the goads.
So an axe, it's hard to kick against the goads. I found this in Euripides' Bacchae as well.
You answer because you know more than I do then.
No, I do not. Far from it. I just have heard this specifically from some of the other academics who looked at this and they said, hold on, an axe, Paul uses the same phrase. Now, someone might come along and say it's just a common phrase used in the Greco-Roman world. People have used it because they've been influenced by Euripides' Bacchae play. The other idea is we're dealing with text, just like you're talking about with the Gospels. And here's someone looking at text and going, well, let's see. Dionysus was a son of God. If you didn't recognize him as a son of God, punishment was going to come. Okay. There seems to be a common trope and maybe a literary trope in having Paul say hard to kick against the goads. Plus they also say, just a fun fact that I thought was interesting, when Paul gets converted in Acts 9, or if we can call it that, he has the experience. Let's not use conversion because I know Paula Fredrickson hates.
You could use conversion, like turning.
Okay,
turns
right.
From one to the other. Yeah.
But that idea that he is blinded and there's a bright light and he can only, Jesus is the one who says, hey, why do you persecute me? Paul, or Saul, why do you pursue me? Which is actually a reference to 1 Samuel where David is running from Saul. And he says, Saul, why do you pursue me? Same Greek word for persecute. The flashing light where he blinds him is, who is the uncle of Dionysus in that play that doesn't recognize him, but he goes out to the Maenads?
Oh, I don't know. You'd have to, not off the top of my head.
I don't remember. No, it's fine. I can't remember his uncle's name. Are you hearing a noise? I feel like I hear something. Maybe I'm listening to you.
I think you might be having an experience.
I'm having an experience. In fact, it's actually your lecture that just turned on from the one you emailed me. I'm like, I'm hearing you, and I'm like, but you're not saying anything. Anyway, someone might notice in the chat the name. Point is, he has a blinding light while he's hiding in the tree looking at the Maenads. And Dionysus blinds him, and then they shred him apart, and they take him, put his head on a pike, and go back in the city. Jesus shows mercy where Dionysus actually condemns him. So anyway, we're sidetracked.
This idea that there has to be some kind of physical change that takes place as well, and that kind of turning, that's not unusual either. To symbolize some kind of engagement with the primary deity.
Right.
So whether it's something communicated through literary strategy or a literary strategy in and of itself, that's not uncommon.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been a blast. We've caught up. I thank everyone for your super chats, your support. Please go get her book. Let me pop this up here. Please go get The Origins of Early Christian Literature. I'm looking forward to your updated On the Moon with Paul and all of that. You teased
I'll
us
come
quite
back,
well.
when that comes out, and then I'm hoping to finish the second book actually over the summer. So hopefully we'll have more to talk about coming up.
Same here. I'm working on editing a bunch of stuff right now that will end up on Patreon sometime soon. Every month there's a drop off for whatever reason. People at the end of the month don't have their payment plan set up, where they just wanted to come and watch what they could. I could use some help. So to keep MythVision going, I appreciate everybody who does join it or become a member of the YouTube channel just to help me keep doing what I'm doing and bringing the scholars that I am. And don't forget the Passion Translation today. This guy really did have Jesus come and blow on him. And I didn't even get far into that. But seriously, is there any final words you want to say to our audience? How can we help support? What can we do?
Oh no, just I'm always happy to come here and talk about any of these materials. I always try to be careful about what I know, so I don't mean to be disappointing because I'm not as like salacious I think as some guests could be, but I'm always happy to convey what I know, and I always learn a lot actually about what I don't know, but also put on the spot. I was thinking it's almost like having an exam a little bit, like when
Yeah.
I come here, what exactly do I know off the top of my head? So it's always, I think, or I hope, mutually beneficial. So I'm always happy to be here and always appreciative of what you put together for helping make these connections with the public.
I hope everybody in the chat will get on her, because I've been telling her to do a Patreon, and she has a lot of courses that she technically could, get the help to help with her family and her child and stuff like that. Your husband would appreciate it, I'm sure too, but seriously, we got to get you a Patreon. And then occasionally when you have the time, you can go check messages or whatever and say hey to fans or answer questions, whatever. But yeah, I'm working on that. I'm trying. We will have you back, hopefully, to do the discussion/debate, however we want to formulate that, on who wrote the Gospels. And thank you for your time. Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision.